Each night, I awake to a face looming over me. I think it's getting closer. Written by Yen Renisum 1. Let me start off by making something very clear. I am in a hurry. I'm making this post about my experiences in the past 2 weeks in hopes that anyone out there might know something that can help me. It's morning now, and I'm quickly typing this out on my laptop in my bedroom. The rest of the day is going to be spent researching, scouring the web and beyond for anything that could save me. If all that fails, you, readers, are my last hope. I beg you, if you know anything, reply quickly, because if I don't find an answer by the time the sun sets, I'm certain that I will not live to see it return. It all started a couple of weeks ago. I spent my day like any other. I woke up, walked down the creaky stairs of my old house, and enjoyed a quiet bowl of unsweetened cereal in my kitchen. I went to work at my office. I made small talk with my coworkers, replied to more emails than I care to count, and then I drove home in the evening with the intent to relax on my couch with a good movie. Unfortunately, that isn't how it all panned out. During my drive home, I got a flat tire when passing by the old woods on my route home. The street lamps overhead thankfully kept me brightly lit as I stepped out and began to inspect the damage to my old car. And when my phone, of course, turned out to be dead, one of the friendly people living in the houses across the street was happy to invite me in for a coffee while I used their phone to call a repair vehicle to come and bail me out. I had a nice chat with the friendly middle-aged man while I waited, and the mechanics did their job quickly once they arrived. Half an hour later, I bid goodbye to my new friend and returned to my car as the glaring taillights of the repair van disappeared into the gloom at the end of the road. As I walked up, I noticed something odd. The trunk of my car wasn't fully shut. It was as if someone had opened it and had not bothered to properly close it. Now, seeing that my car was old and really contained nothing of value, I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed that the repairman had popped it open to check for a spare tire and had not bothered to close it again. So I just sighed and simply pushed it closed myself. I felt a strange resistance when I did, as if something large was in there. But by this point, I was too exhausted from the long day to really care. I just chalked it up to the repairmen chucking the flat tire in my car so that they didn't have to dispose of it. Cursing their laziness, I stepped back into my car and continued my drive home. Now, although I have zero evidence of this, I strongly suspect that this is where it all began. Whatever or whoever was in my trunk, I brought it home with me. And unwittingly, I doomed myself to a fate that I'm currently hoping I'll never have to discover. When I got back, I pulled into the driveway of my home. Now, for reference, because it will be important later, my house is quite large. It's an old rustic wooden building, 2 stories, located along a long stretch of road with many other similar-looking houses. My backyard is pretty big as well, separated from the fairly untamed woods behind it by a short fence. Now, with all of that out of the way, I entered my house, kicked off my shoes, and went straight up to bed. This is where things started to go wrong. I awoke in the middle of the night with a start. My vision came to me immediately, as if my eyes had been opened before I'd even been roused to consciousness. And what I saw caused me to almost leap right out of my bed. Something was looming over me as I slept. An unnaturally thin figure wearing frayed brown rags, sleeves short enough that I could see the shriveled gray skin on its bony arms. Its face, however, was the worst part. Hovering directly over my own, only around a foot away. Hovering directly over my own, only around a foot away, was the horrible visage of something that can be described as nothing less than monstrous. The skin, like on its arms, was gray, wrinkly, and so shriveled around its painfully sharp bone structure that it looked as if it could snap at any time. Its eyes bulged out of its ghoulishly defined sockets, yellow around the edges with pupils so dilated that it was hard to make them out in the darkness. Long strands of dry, frayed hair fell down all around its head, long enough to gently tickle my face, and its smile, that horrible smile, it seemed to bore into my very soul. However, as I leapt upwards in pure terror, the thing was no longer there. Now, I know what you're thinking. If it disappeared so quickly, how come you got such a good look at it? That's the strangest thing. I said it felt as though my eyes were open before I even awoke, and I believe that might have indeed been the case. I had the memory of this figure, this very sight that I woke up to, in my dreams. As if my subconscious had registered this sight even before I did and woke me up so that I may experience its disgusting stare in full. For this reason, the image was, most regrettably, burned into my mind. I didn't get any more sleep that night. I didn't even try. I practically ran down the stairs, dressing myself haphazardly, and I burst out of the front door. I was in such a half-awake panic at the time that I didn't even notice my car's trunk was once again slightly open. I paced around my driveway for a few minutes, wiping sweat from my dripping brow as I desperately tried to calm my beating heart. Eventually, my body released some of its tension, and I was able to once again think with a clear head. A nightmare, I thought. Of course, that was all it was. I almost laughed at myself for having such an over-the-top reaction. I was, after all, a grown man, not a child who jumps at phantoms. I had a quiet cigarette leaning against my car, and then I went back inside. Even though I had convinced myself that it was nothing, I didn't go back to bed. I spent the remaining hours of the night rewatching a box set of my favorite show, and before I knew it, it was time to go to work again. The next day went much the same as the one before, although a few co-workers did point out how obviously tired I was. I pushed through, though, doing my work to the best of my ability. By the time I arrived home after an uneventful drive, I had almost forgotten about the terror of the night before. This time, I fulfilled my previous goal and enjoyed a relaxing evening on the couch with a good film and a nice meal. Soon, I retired to my bed, feeling calm and content. As I'm sure you've guessed by now, though, that wasn't to last. Once again, I awoke in the night to see the exact same sight as before. The horrid creature hovering over me with that oh-so-malignant smile. Still in the same place, the same position. And once again, I leapt up in fright. Just like before, it was gone immediately. I jumped out of bed again, though not quite so panicked this time. Although too many thoughts were racing through my head, I didn't feel like I was in danger, seeing as the same thing had happened the day before and I was still there to suffer the repeat. I checked the time on my phone. 4:39 a.m. I furrowed my brow. That was pretty much around the same time that I had woken up the night before. estimating how long it was until I had seen the time on my TV screen after the little episode. I pushed the thought away, knowing that I couldn't handle another workday running on empty, and I quietly crawled back into my bed and under the covers. It took me a little while, but I eventually drifted back into a deep slumber. That was the last good night's sleep that I've gotten. The next day was another simple one. I went to work, this time making time for a few drinks with my coworkers after, and then returned home. Another boring but blissful evening, and then I was straight back in that god-forsaken bed. When I was once again awoken by that horrid sight, I wasn't quite as scared as before. Once my body had gotten over the initial shock, I found myself more puzzled than anything else. Placing a reminder on my phone to do some research on recurring nightmares in the morning, I placed my head back on the pillow and closed my eyes. Then I realized it. I thought back to that horrible figure standing over me, and I realized that this time the sight was different. Only slightly, but different nonetheless. This time I could remember seeing more detail. The horrid texture of its skin like coagulated paint. The faint but bloodshot capillaries crawling from the edges of its eyes like jagged tentacles. And the hair. I remembered feeling the hair, not merely scraping the edges of my skin, but laying upon it, folding on it as if it had at least a couple of inches of slack. That was when it clicked. The thing was closer this time. My eyes shot open and I swung my legs over the side of my bed as my breathing began to quicken. I still thought I was being irrational, getting all worked up over a nightmare. If anything, I tried to convince myself, it was good that it was different. If it was identical again, that would be weirder now, wouldn't it? I tried to shake myself out of my stupor, but needless to say, I didn't get any more sleep that night. The hours flew by as I sat in my kitchen Googling reoccurring dreams on my phone, looking for anything that might explain my strange hallucinations. I didn't find anything reliable, and when the time came to head to work, I still felt uneasy. It was cold outside, and I could see my own breath as I stepped out. I donned my winter coat and my scarf. I drove to work listening to the drowning voices of talk radio, hoping to distract myself. It worked somewhat, and I was able to enter the office looking as if nothing was wrong. When I got home that night, I didn't dare sleep in my bed. I swiped a spare blanket and I curled up on my sofa, feeling somewhat more at ease as I drifted off to the background noise of my television. When I awoke again, at the exact same time as the last 3 nights, the creature was upon me still. Its posture was slightly different, as it bent over the back of the sofa, its now visible bony fingers seeming to claw into the upholstery. And just as I had feared in my darkest thoughts, it was closer. Its face was now at least 2 inches closer to my own than it had been when I had first seen it. 2 inches that felt so significant when its visage became more and more horrid with each one. I didn't jump out of bed this time. I didn't even blink. The image faded away on my retinas. I simply lay still, and I cried. That was Saturday, and I was ever so grateful for it. I felt tired beyond belief, and I knew I had no time for working. The first thing I did with my free day was to pay a visit to my doctor. I told her about what I was experiencing, and she prescribed some sleeping pills that would supposedly help. I was grateful, but it still wasn't enough to ease me. As irrational as I thought it was at the time, something deep within me was convinced that this was something bigger. With my pills still sitting unopened on my table, I opened my phone and I began to search for exorcist in my area. Soon enough, I was texting with Brother Percival, a priest at some church I'd never heard of, just on the other side of town. I told him of my situation and we scheduled a visit for the following Monday. That night, I took the maximum dosage of those pills and I slept uncomfortably in the back of my car. It was cold and my legs were too long to lie flat. But I was intent on not staying in that house another night until the exorcist arrived. As I expected, deep down, I awoke again to the creature's horrid face. It was closer again. I estimated about half an inch, poking in between the front seats of my vehicle. It was that terrible night that I finally began to smell it. The creature's odor, like that of burnt plastic and sewage, irritated my nose and seemed to permeate the interior of my car, even after the creature had vanished from sight. That was the night I became certain that this was no trick of the mind. That day, I decided I had no choice but to try and catch up on my sleep during the sunlight hours. I remained in my car, and I was relieved to wake up in the early evening without any signs of my stalker. I spent the remaining hours catching up on my neglected routine, taking a shower, eating a proper meal, and doing some stretches to ease my body after so long spent in a cramped vehicle. When the sun went down, I spent the entire night sitting on my sofa with every light in my living room on full blast, including the TV, which blared out the cheesy dialogue of random rom-coms on maximum volume. I wasn't taking any chances that night. Falling asleep was simply not an option. I watched the clock behind me smugly as it turned from 4:38 a.m. to 4:39 a.m. Then I turned my attention back towards the screen. When I did, I jumped out of my seat and screamed. In front of me, the figure was there again, staring me right in the face as I turned. Evidently, another half-inch closer than before. Like always, it was gone the moment that I saw it, but somehow the memory of it still felt longer than it should have. I cursed, swore, and threw the TV remote onto the ground so hard that the batteries flew loose and scattered across the room. I didn't bother going to work that day. I had more important things to do. The exorcist arrived mid-afternoon, kind enough to not comment on the dark bags under my eyes and my muttery speech. I described to him as best I could what had gone on. I showed him the various places that I had seen the horror. He nodded slowly and then turned to me. "I do believe I can help you," he said, his aged voice gravelly yet soft. "I'll need to stay overnight to ensure any spirits I expel do not return. So I advise you to find yourself alternative accommodation for the night." I was relieved at his suggestion. I thanked him again for his help, and I went about booking myself a hotel room. I didn't wait until the evening to head there, instead opting to treat myself to a buffet lunch and a swim in their pool. By the time night fell, I was asleep in a comfortable bed within the large cream-color hotel room. I was foolishly expecting a quiet night's rest. I awoke the same as always, with the creature standing beside my bed, its face now nearly twice as close as when I had first seen it. Already, it felt far more intimate than before, as if the creature didn't fear me in the slightest bit, like I was capable of doing nothing to defend myself. I drove home and entered my house in a fury. As Brother Percival gathered his things, he turned to me with a soft smile. "The house is free of unwanted guests," he said. "I am certain." I snarled at him, grabbing the nearest glass from my coffee table and chucking it at him. "Liar! Charlatan!" I shouted, throwing more and more objects in his direction as he slammed his case shut and shambled to the door. "Get out of my house!" I screamed. It was kind of Brother Percival not to call the police. That night, I had a brilliant idea. As I lay back in my own bed, I pulled the covers over me. I grabbed a roll of masking tape from my bedside, and I began to tape my eyelids shut. It was uncomfortable, but I was willing to do anything by this point. I awoke again, as I'm sure I needn't repeat. And somehow, defying my belief, I saw the figure still. Not only the figure, but the surroundings of the room as well. I lurched up, grabbing my eyes to check what had happened to the tape. To my shock, surprise, and then horror, I clutched the edges of the 2 tape strips. I removed them from my face, and I felt my eyelids open. I blinked again and again. My eyes had been closed. But how could that be? I asked myself. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that whatever this thing was, even my own eyelids could not protect me from perceiving its traumatic visage. At least, by this point, I was slightly used to the turn of events. I tried not to dwell on the fact that the creature was now closer once more. The next few nights were not eventful. Some of them I tried silly rituals that I found online. Others I slept upright, upside down, anything to try and change what was happening to me. Nothing worked. And as the evil thing grew closer and closer, I grew paler and paler. I lost my appetite. I lost any desire to work or even enjoy myself. I spent my days desperately searching for something that I could do to help me before it was too late. That was 5 days ago. I cannot even begin to describe the terror I felt when I awoke last night to find the thing only half an inch from my face. The things I saw are indescribable, and I can do nothing to get them out of my head. As I sit here, I treasure the moments I'm describing to you, the horrid things I saw previously, simply because the images it conjures in my head, they are divine in comparison to what I've seen since, and they can, if only briefly, push away the soul-eating sight that just won't let me be. Things have only gotten worse. When I entered my house this morning, I could swear the walls weren't as wide as they used to be. Looking out into the garden, the areas my fence encompasses is less than half of what I remember. The dark branches of the woods seeming to grow ever closer to my window. I sit here at my desk, which I know is on the opposite side of the room from my bed. And yet, from here I can reach my duvet, even the door handle. The whole world is closing in on me, and I don't know what to do. Please, if anyone out there knows anything, absolutely anything that could save me, please, 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 just tell me. I can feel the night approaching, coming ever closer, closing in to consume the earth once more. And I know that with it, my nightmare too will finally consume me.